is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. The pandemic is remaking the college landscape, especially when it comes to who's enrolling and who's opting to take a pass on pursuing a degree, at least for now. We're going to talk about that, and also what's it like to teach college journalism these days. We're joined by Jon Marcus, higher education editor for the Hechinger Report. Jon, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thanks very much, Emily. It's nice to be here.
I do want to talk about a few of your recent stories, which share a common theme of looking at how the pandemic has affected enrollment in both baccalaureate and advanced degree programs like medical school. But I want to start with this distressing figure. There's been a huge drop in the number of men going to college, and in fact, the decline is 7 times as big for men as for women. What's going on?
So this is a trend that we've been watching for years. It's essentially a really interesting reversal. About 40 years ago, men outnumbered women in college. So a number of things happened as a result. We did a really good job at encouraging women to go to college, and we didn't really pay attention anymore to doing the same thing for young men in high schools. And then a number of other things sort of compounded that. What's made the number particularly worrisome this year is that young men are more likely, we're told, to be relied upon by families, low-income families in particular, that need financial help, someone else working, for example. And so men have delayed or essentially just blown off the idea of going to college in order to help support their families. Often what happens as a result of that is that they settle down, buy a car, have a family, get a mortgage. And once that cycle has begun, even with the best intentions, they may not return to college. As with almost everything else in higher education, and particularly during the pandemic, this disproportionately affects young men whose parents didn't go to college or who come from families with low incomes. And the number of men now is just over 40% of total enrollment. That is a huge imbalance. And there are other reasons for it. Men are often more likely to face disciplinary action or to kind of check out during very pivotal times of their primary and secondary education, particularly in middle school. And that is among the reasons that we're seeing them sort of disappearing from enrollment.
So to be clear, we're talking about a domino effect. I mean, obviously, it doesn't just start when a kid leaves high school deciding whether or not they're going to go to college. It's everything that came before. And the disproportionately harsh discipline that these young men were facing had an impact on their college choices and opportunities.
Right. I would suggest that's one reason of a sort of a patchwork of reasons. There are other signs that are problematic here. Dual enrollment is way down. Like everything that I hope we'll have an opportunity to talk about today, this is an example of how the pandemic is more than a one-year problem. This is a problem that is going to have ramifications for years, if not decades, relative to enrollment, relative to socioeconomic divisions. And so what's happening with men has become more pronounced this year. Part of it is discipline. Dual enrollment, which I mentioned, is way down. What dual enrollment has tended to do over time is give high school students as young as sophomores the confidence to understand that college isn't the intimidating, obstacle that they perceived it to be, that they can actually do the work. On top of that, they can accumulate credits. So if they do go to college, they'll be able to do it more quickly and at a lower price. The big decline in dual enrollment is a huge canary in the coal mine, a warning sign that we're going to see even fewer students who may not feel comfortable about college, going to college at all, and those who do having to pay more and take more time to finish.
So for our listeners who may not be familiar with it, dual enrollment programs are when students in high school have an opportunity to start taking community college level classes for credit. Typically, they take them at community college and can actually leave high school with credits or even a full associate's degree.
Right, and we're seeing double-digit declines in dual enrollment, in particular in rural areas. There's not a really good kind of system to track dual enrollment. In fact, it's really hard, and we've been trying to get a sense of exactly how many students take dual enrollment, but there's no real centralized source of data for that. There are some new organizations and associations that are working on it. Where we've begun to hear about this is from community colleges in rural areas. whose own enrollment has declined significantly. And when we begin to parse that trend, we're seeing that they are including dual enrollment students in their overall enrollment and that their numbers are declining significantly, in part because of massive double-digit percentage drops in dual enrollment. I wasn't aware that they were including dual enrollment high school students in their overall enrollment, but the fact that they are has allowed us to kind of see this really concerning trend of students who don't have these courses this year available to them and may not, as a result, continue on to college. One of the great advantages of dual enrollment, and there are many controversial elements of it, but one of the advantages is that it has encouraged more students to go on to college who might not have without having the experience of taking college level courses while in high school.
Well, let's talk about the men and then we're going to go to the rural students. But for men specifically, is this disproportionately affecting Black and Brown students?
It's hard to tell. So the gender and race sort of categories aren't necessarily calculated or reported to us in ways that allow us to see it. Anecdotally, yes. I spent some time at a high school that serves a low income neighborhood in central Massachusetts a few weeks ago with a colleague from National Public Radio, meeting with young men, predominantly Black and Hispanic in this case, who were actually they were going to college, but they spoke with us about the challenges that they had overcome to even get to that stage, and the fact that many of their classmates weren't. So, from what I've seen on the ground doing reporting, and we are in fact doing in person reporting in many of these cases, standing outside wearing masks at a distance, yes, as with almost everything else, this is affecting lower income, first generation Black and Hispanic men more than men from higher on the income scale.
On the rural question, what is the big tension here? Is it a lack of access because you already had these pre-existing higher ed deserts, or are rural students suffering more in terms of finding the money to get to the schools that they can reach?
As with men, the problem with enrollment from rural high schools has a lot of causes. It's everything from sort of political orientation. There are some really interesting Pew survey that suggests that men, and particularly fathers in rural areas, don't like the idea of college. There are, political issues involved with whether they think colleges are too liberal and whether they want their children to go off to a college somewhere else and not come back, which in fact is what happens often to rural students who go off to college. You have financial issues, obviously. I spent some time with an NPR colleague at the University of Michigan, which is one of the few universities that actually have programs to support rural students in the same way that they have programs to support racial and ethnic minorities and urban students from under resourced urban high schools. And it was fascinating seeing a white kid from rural Louisiana sit down with an upper class mentor who was a Black kid from inner city Detroit. And we were able to sit in on this conversation. They essentially had everything in common. They came from single parent households, they came from crappy high schools, and all of these things worked against them in very similar ways that I think a lot of people, until maybe 2016, really weren't paying attention to. And by a lot of people, I mean policymakers and frankly journalists who weren't paying enough attention to rural America. And one thing I think has happened in the last 4 years is that we were reminded that there's a lot of disaffection, disengagement, and anger in rural America. So that's one part of it. Finance is a part of it. These students that we met in Michigan and Ann Arbor were telling us things like that they couldn't go out for dinner or to socialize with their roommates or friends because they couldn't afford to. We had one student who couldn't figure out the public transportation system. And as you know, at University of Michigan is a very big campus. And she was late for class all the time because she wouldn't take the bus. She couldn't figure it out. Public transportation isn't something that people have in rural America. And this one really struck me. She would wait at the crosswalk in Ann Arbor while everyone else was just jaywalking, because I realized also, as someone who's also from a rural area, there aren't crosswalks in rural America. Little things like this really alienate rural students. So the numbers show that rural students graduate from high school at very high rates. They go to college at the lowest rates of anyone, including urban racial and ethnic minority students. And they also drop out at higher rates than anyone because they feel homesick and unsupported. So what I've found, I was up in northern rural Maine speaking to some extraordinary, really smart high school kids, rural high school kids. And they are in a hybrid situation. So they're online part time. A lot of other programs and extracurricular activities have been cut back. They are demoralized, like all of us are this year. They worry that if they go to college, it will continue to be online even next year when all of us are hoping things might begin to return to normal. They're not so confident of that. Their families often have even worse financial situations than they did before, so they feel an obligation to stay home and help. Many of the students that we met with, one young woman in particular, she said she'd work at a supermarket next year and then go to college. Unfortunately for her, the data show that once a student puts off college, it is very, very unlikely that they'll ever go. So that is an area of huge concern. It also threatens, as with many of the trends we're talking about today, it threatens to even further widen the socioeconomic divide in the United States, as rural students in particular receive less of the higher education that we know empirically results in higher incomes, better health outcomes, and things like that. It's just all going in the wrong direction.
So, we've talked a little bit about the risk that's here, both short term and long term, for students and also the communities and their families. But this is also a big risk for colleges. I remember being at a rural high school in New Hampshire on the same day that a local college had set up in a classroom and was offering instant admission reviews. And I was watching high school juniors and seniors walking in and walking out 30 minutes later, knowing whether or not they would be accepted and likely how much it would actually cost them to attend. You can't do that in a pandemic.
No, you can't. And the results are already beginning to come in. You've seen, so Common App just released some application numbers for this current admission cycle. And you're seeing selective and large universities, in particular flagship publics, doing really well. Actually, their numbers are up, way up in some cases. But small colleges and less selective colleges, often in rural America, but not exclusively, are seeing declines in the number of applications. That is the last thing that they need this year.
What are some other long-term risks that we're looking at in terms for students? I mean, do we know anything about students who actually get to college and then drop out, how that affects their career trajectory versus kids who don't even get to start?
Yeah, so there's a lot of kind of churn going on right now in terms of where students selected to begin their educations. Those who did go to college in the fall, many of them decided to stay closer to home. Some of them, again, were anecdotally telling us they wanted to go to community colleges. In fact, community college enrollment is way down. So I'm not really sure how that panned out. Many of them may rethink their decisions and try to transfer, which is going to create sort of a flurry of activity this year. But when you talk about long-term ramifications, this leads to something that I think is really, really important. So all of us who cover higher education have been very understandably consumed with what is going on right now. Who's open, who's not, who's virtual, what's going on with COVID testing and restrictions and limitations. But one thing that's really going on right now that we need to pay a lot more close attention to is we are right in the middle of the admissions cycle. And admissions is one of those many things in higher education that happens behind closed doors, and we don't typically see how or why decisions have been made. But this year, we have some really interesting clues with even more dire long term implications, and then a few glimmers of hope. The admission cycle is underway now. What we already know is that there was a huge increase in early decision. And before I get to that, actually, let me talk about more broadly what the most concerning trend is. The most concerning trend is that the extraordinary inequity in admission is becoming even worse this year. So no one would be surprised to know that rich kids do better in college admissions and they go to better colleges than poor kids, even poor kids with the same or better academic records. So if you look at eighth grade standardized test results, and I'm being flip here, but the dumbest rich kids go to better colleges than the smartest poor kids. And that's becoming even more pronounced because the advantages of more affluent families are even more helpful to them in a pandemic. And the disadvantages that affect lower income students are even worse. So we can see some things that are happening in the admission cycle. One is early decision. Early decision was up by double digit percentages at the most selective institutions. 30%, 20% up at Yale and Harvard and Princeton. Duke, Rice, other institutions reported very high early decision. As you know, early decision disproportionately benefits wealthier students because early decision locks you in if you are accepted to an institution before they even tell you your financial aid. Many of those elite institutions have very generous financial aid, so students are less concerned about that, but nonetheless, it disproportionately affects higher income students. So we've already seen a lot of more affluent families kind of taking advantage of the early decision process. And the problem that creates is that half of the classes are now full, as much as half of the classes in institutions like the University of Pennsylvania, which fills more than half the class or has historically with early decision applicants. Who are those early decision applicants? Surprisingly, this year, some elite institutions told us who those early decision applicants are. They don't usually do that. But if you look really closely, as we're all supposed to do as journalists, at the numbers, so Brown, among other Ivy institutions, talked very proudly of the number of people of color. But people of color include the numbers of applications, if you look at Common App data, are about flat for US citizen applicants. The increase is among international students who, now that the coronavirus pandemic might in fact be, we might see some signs of progress. And now that the last presidential administration is out of office, we are seeing a return from international students who are applying from some countries, with the exclusion of China. And so when you report people of color, often institutions will include international students of color. And they also will group students of color together in ways that might not allow us to see whether some of the groups that are most severely underrepresented, which are Black or Hispanic, we can't tell what's actually going on. So it's really important that you look beyond that term and ask, as we did. We asked Brown yesterday, and they would not break down that number beyond just saying people of color, which can lead to an interpretation that these are not necessarily the groups that we think they are when people report that.
Can you give us some examples of what you've seen at specific colleges?
So, among the students admitted early decision at Dartmouth, 15% of them were legacy admits, which mean their parents went to Dartmouth. That is not something that necessarily benefits low income, first generation underrepresented students. Harvard reported that just under 15% of their early admits are low income based on the fact that they qualify for federal Pell Grants. Well, that's really good. And that's actually an increase for Harvard, but it's half of the national average of students who qualify for Pell Grants. So, in fact, early decision is what it always has been, which is an advantage to more affluent students. Many institutions wouldn't even report that level of nuance or granularity, so we don't even know who those students are. But we can infer from data from previous years that this not only benefits well off kids, but that students admitted by early decision are 3 times more likely to be white.
What do we know right now about the testing landscape, especially since many schools have gone test optional? Is that an equity issue? Are more affluent kids still taking those tests? And does that benefit them?
Yeah. So the other advantages that wealthier families have are even more pronounced this year. They can afford test prep, tutoring, and private college admissions counselors, which cost $200 an hour on average. Lower income students can afford those things. Lower income students often go to early resourced high schools that, in the best of times, don't have a lot of college counselors. This year, college counselors are available only remotely or by email or FaceTime, and they are also being pulled in a million directions because of mental health issues involving students feeling isolated in remote learning environments. I spoke to a student this week, a low income first generation student in a high school in Florida, who said she didn't want to bother her counselor, her guidance counselor, because the guidance counselor was so overwhelmed. Wealthier families can afford to hire someone to advise their kid. They can hire a coach to help their student write their college essay. I spoke to another student yesterday in Nebraska, first generation low income, who almost missed the deadline for her first couple of applications. And these are incredibly smart kids. She wants to become a doctor. The student in Florida is applying to Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, and broke out in tears trying to fill out the FAFSA form, the free application for federal student aid, the form required to get financial aid, because her father wasn't available to help her. Her guidance counselor wasn't available to help her. She's a 17-year-old that had to figure out how to fill out this very complicated form herself. So wealthier parents also have found open testing centers to take their kid to take the SAT. They have driven across state lines or several counties away to be able to take the SAT and SAT. It is true that almost 1,700 colleges this year are test optional. That doesn't mean that if you have a good score, they're not going to pay attention to it. And wealthier families know this to be true. And they're doing what they can to find an SAT or ACT testing center that's open and available, trying to get a good score. Testing companies like Signet Education report a record year this year. which is exactly the reverse of what you would expect. In fact, it's exactly the reverse of what they expected. I spoke to the CEO of Signet, who said that they had to revise their financial estimates because they saw so much more test prep business this year. So all of these things are just widening the gulf.
We're talking about colleges, enrollment dips, and what's ahead on the higher education landscape with Jon Marcus of the Hechinger Report. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who's taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and your feedback are helping us to grow. Jon, I wanted to mention you teach journalism at Boston College. What's in your syllabus this semester? And I'm interested, how has it changed from last year?
I do have the privilege of teaching college students. It's one of my favorite things I get to do all week, and I learn a lot from them. We're in person, which is interesting, although we had a snow day this week, so my classes didn't meet. It's interesting that the pandemic hasn't necessarily changed the way that journalism is taught, with the exception of the fact that it's difficult to do a lot of in-person reporting. But a few other things that have happened over the last year, in particular, the social and racial justice movement has significantly changed the conversations that we have. And the election that we just had, and the process of the election and what happened subsequent to the election. All of those things are an incredible teachable moment in journalism because we talk about journalism fairness and equity. We do spend a lot of time on conduct and ethics of journalists. I find that there is a little extra work that has to happen in terms of reminding students that in a democracy, the government works for us. I think many of us have kind of forgotten that. And I don't mean that the government works for us in the sense of let's all storm the Capitol. I mean, the government works for us in terms of we are entitled to know the basis of decisions that are made and the paper trail leading to those decisions. So we spend a lot of time talking about journalism, investigative journalism in particular. I think my students are kind of energized. I have separately written, I write for Neiman Reports, the journal of the Neiman Foundation at Harvard, have separately reported about something that I was noticing as a journalist who visited campuses, which is a real and new assertiveness among student journalists, student newspapers, and in many cases, student newspapers are now student news websites that are being really aggressive in the use of public records requests and other tools. I think because, and they tell me it's because they are watching the example of what's happening on the good side at the national level in terms of people being held more accountable, public officials, public figures being held more accountable. They're holding their own institutions to those kinds of standards. And we saw that at the University of North Carolina in the fall. We've seen some extraordinary work by student journalists. Many of those journalists are students in my classes. So I have an opportunity to sort of engage with them about the ways that they report what they report. And I think it's really interesting as I'm thinking about this, that what's happening in student journalism is a microcosm of the kind of skepticism with which all the rest of us have come to regard what we hear from colleges and universities and what they tell us and how it might or might not actually correlate with facts. So, for example, colleges and universities, as we all know, love to report that 98, 99% of their graduates have jobs. But you have to look very closely into the fine print. This is a personal pet peeve of mine to find where that number comes from. And it comes from the number of people that respond to an email survey. And as you know, Emily, we all respond to every email survey we receive. Well, I do if it's from EWA, but otherwise,
Bless you, Jon.
yeah, I always do. But we probably don't respond to email surveys. And so that now has a name in the great tradition of higher education. It has a pretentious name. They call it the knowledge rate. And the knowledge rate is the number of people that actually respond on which they base that number, that 98% of students have a job. In many cases, the knowledge rate might be as low as 50%. So we know that 98% of half of last year's graduates have jobs. And so I'm seeing my students becoming much more skeptical of authority in that regard. And I think in a way that does relate to the pandemic because last year when everyone abruptly went virtual, I'm very sympathetic to colleges and universities that had to do that. But many of them resisted for a while refunding housing fees, dining fees, or lowering tuition. And when they did lower tuition, they did it because their students were online. They did it grudgingly and only just a little bit. And so I think that has only compounded the pre-existing kind of anger that's been growing, as you can see from public surveys and skepticism about higher education. And so student journalists have run with this and become much more skeptical at North Carolina about things like, why did you open the university and what are you actually doing to protect us, which turned out not to be much, and things like postgraduate placement rates, which aren't what they seem. So I think I've seen a lot of that among my students. I think that they are very attuned to social and racial justice issues, and that's a really thorny question right now. What do we cover? What don't we cover? You've seen student journalists at other institutions, fortunately not the one that I teach at, or student demonstrators that would hold a public protest, as happened at Northwestern University, complaining that student journalists had called them for their comments using the university directory or had posted photos of them in a public protest in a public place. The same thing happened at Harvard, where students complained that the Harvard Crimson, to its credit, covered a protest of undocumented students or in support of undocumented students and called ICE for comment, as a journalist should do. And there were complaints the Harvard Crimson called ICE for comment. That was surreal to me as a journalist. But again, those are really interesting issues that come up in this generation and that we talk about. More generally, pandemic wise, even though we're in person at a distance wearing masks, and students have to quarantine, as one of them just told me this morning she'll be doing next week because her roommate tested positive for COVID. What I see and what I experience in my class is incredible weariness, incredible demoralization. I've had some students, interestingly enough, mostly my students from underrepresented groups who have personally experienced death in their families from COVID, who are dealing with evident, mental health issues. I have students who have been quarantined, missed an enormous amount of class time that they've had to make up. They're not having fun. And, none of us are having fun this year. But college is not what these students are getting. And again, I'm at an institution that's open and I think students are making the best of it, but it's tough. It's not what they expected. And I see that in my classrooms. So I worry a little bit also about how much learning is going on. I think there are a lot of distractions for these students also. And I think that all of us who are faculty are being a little bit more lenient about things like absences, and that, in the short term is a good thing. In the long term, I worry might be a problem. As we were talking, I just got a second email from another student that's going to have to quarantine this week. So that is a real world kind of update that I see every week in class that reminds me of where we are right now.
Jon, I don't want to let you go without asking for at least one quick story idea that you'd like to see some other higher education reporters focusing on in the coming months.
What we should all be focusing on is the long-term implications of what's happening here. Not who's bought plexiglass or hand sanitizer, but what happens later. How will dual enrollment affect long-term enrollment trends? What will happen with Matt? Because we're going to see another cycle of this. There's no question, at least one. And depending on how fast the economy recovers or fails to recover, how long is this going to go on before college campuses are predominantly made up of women? If they're already almost 60%. And so looking forward is something that I think this year has been hard for all of us, but I think is essential when you cover higher education. And also the admissions process going on right now. I've spoken sort of at 39,000 feet about what we know from Common App. First gen's down, low income is down based on students that qualified for the fee waiver. It's down 2%. First generation, it's down 3%. That doesn't sound like much, but everything else was up. So we're seeing, again, poor students, first generation students being left out as usual. But, look at what's going on at admission in your institutions. Someone interestingly pointed out to me, they're in a squeeze. On the one hand, they need tuition paying students. So we've seen over the years non-need based aid increasing. They leverage that to attract students who can pay at least part of the tuition. That's been increasing. We haven't seen the discount rate yet from the last spring admissions process, but we also saw universities just throwing financial aid at kids, even kids that didn't need it. That is now coming up against the commitments that they made last summer to racial and social justice. How will they overcome their huge revenue shortfalls in the admissions process? Will they keep giving financial aid to rich kids just to have tuition paying students? Or will they stay true to the commitments that they broadcast last summer after the George Floyd killing to racial and social justice? That's a question that needs to be covered at the local level at your local university and college.
Jon Marcus is the higher education editor for the Hechinger Report, and he joined us from his home office in Boston. Jon, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thanks so much for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For nearly 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.